Okay. Right, Sophie, over to you. And welcome, sorry.
Lovely, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Sophie Durand. I'm the head brewer of Burnt Mill Brewery in Suffolk, England. We've been brewing for nearly 8 years, or actually 8 years this month. And I've been head brewer there from the start. And I'll explain a little bit about myself and why we do quite a lot of gluten-free beers as we go along through the presentation. So to start off with, I just put this up here. I'll never understand 5,000 years of eating bread, and suddenly in the course of a decade, everyone is allergic to gluten. Now, allergic or intolerant are two different things, or allergies and intolerance is two different things. This necessarily isn't according to allergies, but people do develop intolerances. And why is this? Because humans have been around for about 300,000 years. So why all of a sudden are we starting to become more intolerant to things like gluten? Part of the reasons could be due to breeding methods. Our guts, are they designed for more paleo diets? Are we overloading our system with modern lifestyles and toxins, etc.? So if we look at breeding methods, crops these days are bred for yield, bred for disease resistance, drought resistance. All of these require more need for fertilizers and pesticides. Farming generally degrades soil health and weakens the soil's natural biome. So all of this is creating very generic, fast-growing, selectively bred crops. Now, having this in our diet, especially with all the pesticides and fertilizers and lack of the soil's natural microbiomes, is this affecting our guts and is this affecting our bodies? So human domestication started around 11,000 years ago. And what I mean by this is humans started to settle down, they stopped hunting and gathering, and they started cultivating wheat and barley. And there's evidence of wheat and barley being cultivated for the last 13 to 11,000 years ago. And so since then, since we started cultivating grains, populations have been able to grow and we've been able to settle and increase our food intake and change our diets essentially. So as I said, modern humans have been around for around 300,000 years. Our predecessors, so animals or mammals of the Homo genus, appeared around 2 million years ago. And for that whole period, we've been hunter-gatherers. And so it's only really over the last 10,000 years that we have completely changed our lifestyles and completely changed our types of diets. And so naturally, yes, we are able to eat everything that we eat these days, but particularly in the modern era where processed foods have come into play, as I've said about fertilizers, pesticides, all of these things are modern toxins that are entering our systems. And is this creating a low overload in our systems and our guts? And then all of a sudden, our digestive system and our gut and our bodies are reacting to things that are inflammatory, like gluten. Sorry, computer's being quite slow here. So I'll come on to a little bit about how I've come to this stage in my life as well, a little bit later on. But first of all, just talking about the beers itself, because we all love beer, we all want to drink beer, And if we are finding, and particularly later on in life, if we're becoming a little bit more gluten intolerant, we still want to enjoy beer. So you can get two different types of gluten-free beers. You get beers that are naturally gluten-free, and then beers that are gluten removed. So the naturally gluten-free beers are using alternative grains, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then you get gluten removed beers, which are removed by an enzyme. Now, UK and EU law dictate that something can be classed as gluten-free if it is tested below 20 parts per million of gluten. And this is with an official ELISA test. So the ELISA test is an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. So it's an immunological assay commonly used to measure antibodies, antigens, proteins, and glycoproteins in biological samples. So this assay can then measure to see if there is any gluten in our beer samples that we send away. So as part of our practice, we tend to send a whole load of beers away for testing approximately every 6 months. And in between that time, we'll always do in-house tests with something called Gluten Tox Pro. Now, the Gluten Tox Pro is a lateral flow test. So you might remember this from the COVID days and COVID testing. Basically, we take a sample of beer and we put it with a reagent, and then we watch that liquid run up the stem of the little testing stick, and it comes up with a positive and a negative line. Because we know that this test isn't going to be quite as accurate as an ELISA test, we will always test down to 5 parts per million on our beers. And this is just to make sure that we have a little bit more certainty and a little bit more comfort knowing that our beers are going to be gluten-free. So the beers that are out there already are fairly few and far between, but the range is getting better. If you're wanting to try and find naturally gluten-free beers, this is much harder than the gluten-removed beers. And modern examples available in the UK and I think in Europe as well, breweries like Greens. And there is a small brewery in, I think, Essex, I believe, that's called Alt Grain Co. And they brew, they're a small production, but they brew everything without barley or wheat. And then you get, there are quite a few more American breweries, like Ghostfish and Lakefront Brewing. And I believe that they just purely brew alternative grain beers. And if anyone knows of any other breweries that will do alternative grain beers, please pop it into the chat box, because I think all this stuff is really, really interesting. And I do quite like tasting some of these different types of beers as well. Excuse me a moment. So creating naturally gluten-free beers isn't impossible, but it's a little bit more challenging than brewing with barley and wheat. And it also makes it a lot more expensive. And unfortunately, because it is a lot more expensive, it's one reason why we don't make steel cut anymore. Although it doesn't mean to say that we won't make it in the future, but it is something that we have made in the past. So when we're looking at naturally gluten-free beers, we're looking at the different cereals, and these cereals are known as pseudo cereals and ancient grains. So these are grains like sorghum, millet, buckwheat, brown rice, maize, and they're all of the grass family, but they're not necessarily all of them are quite as highly cultivated as barley and wheat. Rice and maize probably are, but the others are a little bit more less processed or less bred, if you understand what I mean by that. And so historically and also currently in hotter climates, like in Africa and in South America, beers like chicha are made from, that's very much a South American beer. And that is made from maize. And then you've got sorghum beers. You have a beer called Mkombothi, which is an African beer, and that's a blend of maize and sorghum. And then you've got various names for millet beers, which again are African beers. Some of these names that you may have come across is Bantu, Malwa, and Pombe. And these are all made just basically getting these grains in a pot and getting all the liquid out of it and then fermenting it. So they're really, really hazy, cloudy concoctions, which are slightly alcoholic, but nobody really knows how much alcohol is going to be in them. In South America, you can get some commercially made chicha. And I think a lot of this is probably, some of it is non-alcoholic as well. But if you go into the back streets of any towns and villages, there's always going to be chicha on the sides. I actually went to Peru and did the Machu Picchu trek, and along the way there's women with their pots of chicha for sale along the pathways. And I just thought it was absolutely wonderful just to see some of that right in front of you. So it's not impossible to make, and on a commercial basis, it is a little bit more difficult because you're going to need slightly different equipment. Because traditionally in the UK, we have our mash tuns or lauter tuns. So we have single infusion mash tuns, which allow the grains to sit in the mash tun without being agitated at all. And then our sparge is showering the grains and washing all of the sweet wort away from it. Lauter tuns, you do have a bit of agitation. So you can get away with loading the mash tun or the lauter tun up with a few more of these different grains, because you've got that movement in there, and so the mash won't get quite as stuck. And other ways are things like mash filters. And these are, you're creating the mash and then you're squeezing the mash between plates and squeezing out all of the wort, which then makes brewing with these smaller types of grains a lot easier and a lot more commercially viable. When you're thinking about brewing with these kind of grains, it's about understanding the specifications and the yields of them as well. Some of them are going to have much higher sugar contents, like maize and rice are going to be a lot higher in sugar, but they don't quite have the enzymes to break down everything that needs to be broken down in terms of beers. So that's where things like oats are very useful. And then sorghum and millet and buckwheat have a small amount of enzymes as well that can break all the starches down into sugars. But oats are going to be your biggest component, particularly for the UK and single infusion mash tuns, that are going to help you break down all the starches into your simple sugars. So it's about getting the balance and understanding how each grain is going to react. So when we're brewing the naturally gluten-free beers, preparation is vital. So for us, when we went about making steel cut, because we still made normal standard barley beer and wheat beer in the brewery, we had to make sure that our vessels were really, really clean. And so we didn't have any cross-contamination happening. And we had to then make the right combination of ingredients as well. So we did test brews on a little homebrew kit, which really helped us to kind of decide if it was going to be possible, and then how to balance out the flavours with the different ingredients that we could get hold of in the UK. Now, the reason why we really wanted to try and make this happen was because when I started brewing at Burnt Mill, I actually couldn't drink beer at all. I had some severe intolerances going on, and I was almost at the point that I wondered if I needed to leave the brewing industry. But I'd made a career for myself in the industry, and I didn't want to give it up, and I didn't want to leave it because it's an industry that I loved. Everyone in the industry is wonderfully friendly, helpful, and encouraging, and it's just a really beautiful bunch of people. So I stuck with it, and I got the job with Burnt Mill, knowing that I couldn't drink the beer, and so creating a new range of beers with the director was fairly challenging. But we made it, and we made it all work. Certainly I can still smell things, but tasting things like mouthfeel and bitterness was all of a bit of a challenge. But at that point, I'd had, I don't know, I can't remember now, 10, 12 years of brewing experience under my belt. So I knew how to put a recipe together, and I knew the basics of brewing. But because of the situation, the director was quite keen on trying to make something a little bit different and something that I could drink as well. And so I was very fastidious about making sure that the vessels were all clean and we didn't have cross-contamination. And so we even went to the point of hand tipping, say, 300-400 kilos of grain into the mash tun because we didn't want to use the auger. Because the auger was going to be very, very difficult to try and clear out of all the barley before putting any oats through it. And certainly after the mashing period, where everything is pretty much in concealed tanks and vessels and pipes, cleanliness and everything else from that end was quite easy, or a little bit easier than certainly making sure the mash tun was clean and free from everything. Excuse me. So a little bit more about myself. So when we were brewing this, and it was wonderful being able to drink it, and it was a very, very strange experience drinking beer again after having not had any for such a long time. But I was then in a world of trying to experience and trying to find some more of these alternative grain beers, because I even found that actually gluten removed beers even still affected me. And I got to the point that a few years down the line, I got to the point that I was actually really struggling with a lot of things. And I had issues with leaky gut, and everything in my body was out of balance. And it just caused me to be fairly miserable, constantly tired and exhausted. And I was really, really struggling. And I've actually spent a long time working with a functional practitioner who's helped me rebalance my body and rebalance my gut lining and get my body working again. So I can actually drink beer again now, which is exciting. However, I'm now just fairly fastidious and don't drink much other than our own beer, unless we're out too much. In the depths of Suffolk where I live, there's not a huge amount of variety out there. But it is wonderful having that experience to be able to drink it again. And it's also helped, I think, in terms of what I'm making and what we're producing, and understanding a little bit more about what the director is wanting out of the beers. So the beers are always a work in progress. But even though we got to the point that we were struggling with making steel cut, we definitely wanted to still have gluten-free options out there. And so we created our Beyond the Furs, which is gluten removed, and now all of our West Coast are all gluten removed as well. But I'll talk about the gluten removed stuff in a little bit. So coming back to steel cut, so I'll stop rambling on about myself, but it's quite interesting as to how I got to this point. So coming back to steel cut, thought I'd actually just share with you one of our little recipes. So this is a few years old now, but it gives you an idea of the ingredients that we used. So we used oat malt, and the reason why we made sure we had plenty of oat malt in there is because it is a husked grain, and having that husk in there really helps with wort separation. So sieving all the water through the mash so we can get all of our sweet wort out. So having that husk in there was really, really important for us. Having the oat malt in there gave us enzymes that for the starch degradation. We had flaked oats in there as well to add a bit of extra body and texture, and to bulk up some of the sugars and some of the enzymes. Maize was in there to definitely bulk up the sugars, and buckwheat was also in there for added characteristics and added flavours. So buckwheat can be quite flavourful in a beer and can give quite a nice nutty kind of characteristic and taste into a beer's malt profile. And you can see down at the bottom as well that we have some dextrose in there as well. And again, this was to bulk up the sugars. Because we found that when we were brewing with our oat malt, our yields were much lower than they would have been with barley. And we probably got around 15 to 20% lower utilisation through the mash tun and through the brew house. We then added some enzymes into this, so some beta glucanase, which actually helped to break down some of the beta glucans, which then also helped to create a few more starches for turning into sugars. So even though we had really low utilization, our fermentation gave us a little bit more extra back in our alcohol yields, but overall our yields for the beer was much lower. And I very nearly left the prices out, but I thought actually be quite interesting for people to see the actual cost of raw materials, or certainly the hops and the malts that are going into a beer. Now, on the malt side, if we were looking at using barley as a base, maybe adding a bit of wheat and dextrin malts or something like that, the malt bill for this kind of beer would be about £200 cheaper, which is a reasonable, substantial amount when you're looking at overall costs. And then hopping, we actually realised that we had to be quite careful with the types of hops that we wanted to use for our steel cut. So our steel cut had changing hops every single time we made it. And this was partly to allow people who couldn't drink standard beer, like myself at the time, to experience and enjoy different hops. So we did an ever-changing hop schedule. But what we discovered is that the beer seemed to hold on to hop burn a little bit more. I don't know if people are familiar with hop burn, but it can be quite a sharp note, a little bit burny at the back of the throat as well. If you drink a beer too young, hasn't had time to settle, if there's just too much hop in the beer, or if you've just done a load of dry hopping into a beer, And then a few days later, you'll still have a bit of that hop burn taste in the mouth. But the only thing that we could deduce from this is that the beta glucans from the brew, because things like your buckwheat as well as your oats are going to be really, really high in beta glucans. If anyone's ever tried to cook with these kind of cereals at home, particularly with oats, they get gloopy. And this is your beta glucans developing and changing and coming out into the water. And so they get really sticky. And we could only deduce that these beta glucans were holding on to certain hop flavors and hop particles that created a little bit of burn in there and a little bit of imbalance of flavors. And so we did have to be very careful about the type of hops that we used and try to stay away from some of the really, really punchy West Coasty kind of hops like the Columbus, Chinook, these really kind of piney, punchy, resinous-y hops. And we had to come down to some hops that were a lot softer and getting a bit of a blend and a balance coming in there, whilst also trying to maintain the great kind of hop profiles, hop forward profiles that we try to create with our beers. So moving on to gluten removed beers, as I said, it's something that we have then tried to encourage and create more of in our brewery. So gluten removed beers do actually happen. Most gluten during the brewing process is removed fairly naturally. Okay, so if you take I say a generic lager, but a lager from any of the big producers throughout the world, even without the use of an enzyme, those beers are probably going to be below that threshold of 20 parts per million due to the brewing process and the production processes. So when we are boiling our beer, boiling our wort, we actually add something called carrageenan, which is a seaweed, and this is our kettle finings. And this is going to be removing our larger haze-forming proteins. And then in the fermenter, as our beer is getting towards the finish stage, we can add things like alginates, we can add silicates, we can add things like pea proteins, and all of these things are going to drop more of the gluten-containing compounds out of your beer. And all these gluten-containing compounds are also haze-forming compounds. So even beyond that, as we get into the packaging stage, doesn't tend to happen so much in the smaller breweries, but in larger breweries, you have diatomaceous earth, which is a kieselguhr powder. Now, diatomaceous earth is essentially a fine white powder, which comes from ancient microbes that have compressed over time, basically from the bottom of the sea kind of thing. And this is used in filters, and the beer runs through it, and actually all the large haze forming proteins and compounds are removed just before the filtering and just before packaging process. But for us in a small brewery, for our normal bright beers, we're using kettle finings, and then we use a pea protein. So all of our beers are vegan as well. So when we're looking at gluten removing enzymes, these are proteases and endopeptidases. So proteases are less specific, and endopeptidases are a little bit more gluten specific targeted. And these enzymes were actually originally used for colloidal stability and extending shelf life in a beer. And now, by colloidal stability, I'm meaning that it's preventing the beer from forming a haze. So it means that it can last for longer on a shelf in a shop without going hazy. So these enzymes originally were used for shelf stability and elongating the shelf life of a beer. It was then discovered that actually these enzymes removed gluten. So gluten is two compounds called gliadin and glutenin, and they combine together into a big old mesh and form your gluten. As you can see, the little image down at the bottom gives you a rough idea of what the gluten kind of protein is. Now, your protease enzyme will go in there and kind of chop that all up randomly and break it all down. It can potentially then start chopping up a little bit more of your dextrin kind of compounds, which are your unfermented sugars, and can potentially actually even produce further fermentation in packaged beer, which can cause beers to explode in pack. Why it's not a problem for larger breweries is because they would pasteurize their beers, and so those enzymes will have been broken down through a heat process. Whereas if you're a smaller craft brewery and you don't have a pasteurization process, then a protease can be a little bit tricky to use. Whereas an endopeptidase, a little bit more gluten specific and a little bit more targeted to the gluten proteins. And so it's a little bit safer and a little bit more assuring for the small craft beers for shelf life stability, as well as removing your glutens and keeping your hazes down. So in our modern styles of beers, bright beers are easy to make gluten-free because they're naturally going to be gluten-free anyway. And as I said earlier, because of this, we have made it a point to make all of our West Coast style and bright beers gluten-free in the brewery. So we add the enzyme, the endopeptidase enzyme, into all of our bright beers. So that's really nice and simple. We don't advertise it on the front of our cans, but anything that is gluten-free will have just in front of the ingredients a gluten-free product. That's how we will make sure that the consumer knows that our beers are gluten-free. Now, if you want to make a gluten-free hazy beer, a little bit more difficult. As you can imagine, everything that I've said has been about making our beers bright. But modern styles of the hazy beers is really rather difficult to make them gluten-free because your gluten removing enzymes are basically a clarity enzyme. And so when we're thinking about our hazy gluten-free beers, we do a few of them. We don't do very many, but that's because we don't feel like we've perfected it. But every now and then we'll give it another go and try and perfect it a little bit more. So ordinarily in a hazy beer, we add wheat, and wheat has far higher gluten content than barley. And so it's then quite tricky to remove that gluten again. So we try and avoid adding wheat into our beers, but we still add, by adding flaked grains, which are generally tend to be raw grains, but they've gone through a micronization process. So they have been through a heat process where the grains have popped inside, they've gelatinized, and then they get rolled or they get kibbled. So you can have torrefied grains as well. So flake grains will tend to have a few more haze forming compounds and proteins in them. So things like your flake barley or flaked oats are a really good addition into your hazy beer grists and trying to make the beer a bit hazier. So keeping those high, keeping the dextrin malts and some chip malts in there as well, keeping those higher. So you're keeping larger types of proteins in the beers are quite useful. And then we have to play about with pHs as well. So playing about with the water profile and the water chemistry is going to help us with trying to keep the beers a little hazier for our gluten-free. So with our gluten-free hazies, we'll still add our clarity, our gluten removing enzyme at the beginning. But luckily, we also have on the market haze stabilizers that we can add into our beers. Now, these can be either hop derived or yeast derived. Both work. We tend to lean towards the hop derived haze stabilizer. I think we find that it just maintains the haze for a little bit longer. And we enjoy knowing that our haze stabilizers are natural byproducts from other industries within the brewing sector. So we have achieved it. And when we do send our beers off for similyzer tests, we will throw in the odd beer that hasn't had gluten-free treatment just to see where our standard is and see how much we have to work on to remove any gluten if we decide to continue and if we want to carry on with that. So it's really nice to have that standard of how our beers sit naturally without any gluten removing enzymes, and then how they work with the gluten removing enzymes, and also make sure that our level of enzymes added is correct for our beers. So that's all the information that I have for gluten-free beers, both naturally and through enzymes. More than happy to take any questions or just have general discussions.
Thanks, Sophie. That was absolutely brilliant and very informative. There are a few questions. I think some of them you've covered in your webinar. The question was asked. You mentioned earlier on that naturally occurring gluten-free is more expensive to produce. What would be the difference typically the cost of a can of non-naturally occurring to naturally occurring? Just to give some ideas of numbers here.
So for us to make the same kind of revenue, we would probably, so our steel cut was 4.3%. Now for us to make the same revenue on that beer compared to our other standard beers, we would probably have to sell it at the same price that we'd sell a 6% IPA.
Right, okay.
I don't do the sales side of things. I couldn't tell you exactly what the kind of markup is or the cost difference is.
Okay, there's a question from Gerald. So he's a home brewer, and he's asking, do you have any suggestions for home brewing with sorghum? Is there a source to find the do's and don'ts? So someone has replied to that. Before I give you the reply, do you have a comment on any suggestions for home brewing with sorghum?
Well, when we brewed with sorghum, we kind of cheated because Muntons made a sorghum extract, which meant that we could just buy some of that and add that into our beers. If I was brewing with sorghum, I would probably have a sieve involved and use a sieve as opposed to a sieve and a spoon, as opposed to like your sort of generic mash tun kind of thing. But I suppose if you're also brewing in a bag, I don't know how you brew as a home brewer, but if you're doing a big pot with a bag, then that might work as well, because you can put the sorghum in the bag and then can squeeze the bag and squeeze everything, all the good juices and wort out of the bag.
Okay, I'll attempt, and I will attempt to read. I don't know. Jens has put I think it's just a response. It's not a question, but I'll be interested in your reaction to this. It's not going to be easy for me to read out because it's quite technical, but let me try. Normally, sorghum needs heat, 85 to 90 degrees Celsius, to get fully gelatinized, approximately 15 minutes. Normally, with an exogenous alpha amylase. Cool down to saccharification temperature and add glucoamylase to create glucose. Maybe you can get pre-gel sorghum or use sorghum syrup.
Yeah, well done.
Right.
Well done, Jen. That, yeah, actually that's a very good description, and he obviously knows more about sorghum brewing than I do. Um, but yes, alpha amylases are going to be very very good for this, because if you're not having any of the other grains like your oats or barley or wheat in there to create the enzymes to break down starches, adding something like an alpha amylase is going to help with your sugar breakdowns.
Okay. Another question from Gerald. In the recipe, there are only late hop additions. Is the beer, as a result, sensitive to oxidation?
So we we didn't have any bittering hop in there. Again, because we felt that the beta glucans held on to components that we didn't want, that upset the balance of the beer. But we do add whirlpool hops, which give flavour and aroma and help with stability of the beer. Because we're adding whirlpool hops in at about 85 degrees to 90 degrees, and we whirlpool for 15 minutes, and then we let the beer rest for a further 20 minutes, half an hour. And so you're getting plenty of those components from the hops to help stabilize and maintain the beer's life shelf and help reduce the oxidation.
I think a question which has been asked, I think you've actually, well, you actually covered it later on. I think it came up earlier on. Does that mean that gluten-free beer must be bright, aka not hazy? But you said you can. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be bright. It can be hazy.
Yes, yes, that
Uh,
is tricky.
yeah. Next question. Are there enough gluten intolerant drinkers out there to make gluten-free beer viable, or are sales reliant on all drinkers buying it? In other words, if you're buying it, I understand the question, because if you think about it, you may not suffer from gluten, but you like the beer. In other words,
Yeah, yeah. So for a long, actually for a long time, we just had our Beyond the Furs as our gluten-free option, and because we didn't feel like the removing the gluten affected the beers at all, we then made all of our West Coast style or bright beer styles gluten-free, with removing the enzymes. Um, and actually, the reason why we did this is because the people who were gluten-free, so celiacs in particular, wanted a bit more variety than just the Beyond the Furs. And so there was that drive to make more of our beers gluten-free. Um, but it's not the only drive for our beers, if that makes sense.
yeah. Anders has asked a question, which I'm not sure you may or may not wish to answer. I think it's a sort of slightly political point. I'll read it out anyway. What is all the fuss about keeping the haze in beer? Is it just about visual impression, or is it impacting the flavour and mouthfeel?
It is very much about the flavour and mouthfeel. So hazy beers tend to be a lot softer on the palate, tend to not have any bitterness. They're not my particular style of beer, I must say. I much prefer a bright West Coast kind of style. I like the bitterness in a beer. But yeah, it's a style that has done really, really well. I think it's a style that's brought a lot of people into the beer industry and into beer drinking, because bitterness is a very, very sensitive kind of flavour and taste, and not everyone can cope with bitterness. And so actually having hazy beers, which are renowned for being more upfront with the hop flavours and upfront with the top notes of the hop flavours, and not so much on the back notes of the bitterness and the malty, cereally kind of flavours. And you get that really nice kind of thick, silky mouthfeel with a hazy beer as well, which you don't get quite so much with your West Coasts. I can drink the odd one here and there, but yeah, I'll always go back to the more of the West Coast styles.
Okay. Next question from Andrew. I'm going to do in two parts because he's asked the question in two parts. First part, with the move to a lot more vegan beers and away from traditional finings, do you think that this has an impact on the amount of secretly gluten-free beers on the market? As it my understanding that the vegan finings used in place of naturally occurring remove or reduce gluten. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, because I think traditional findings did the same thing. So if you were to use traditional findings, you generally use like an alginate or a silicate finding as well to help remove the proteins, and then your isinglass is for acts more on your yeast findings, whereas something like our pea findings actually works on both our proteins and yeast, so it's a bit of a combination findings. And we dose that in tank so that when we come to pack our beer is bright and ready to go, unless we're doing some cask, which we do very little of. But we just add the vegan findings into the cask instead.
Yeah, because I've come across cask gluten-free quite a few at some of the beer festivals I've been
Mhm.
involved with. Yeah. Okay. Right. Next, second half of the question. Additionally, do you think that it's purely cost of testing that stops so many companies labeling their beers as gluten-free? For instance, San Miguel to claim gluten-free on their flagship lager would require massive amounts of testing.
Um, I think it scares a lot of people off. I don't think you it it is costly. So for a single gluten test, you're looking at about £90. If you're looking for multiple tests, you're looking at about £60 a test. And if you're if you've got a production of that sort of scale, you're probably going to be wanting to take several samples all the way through the packaging process so you can get a wide range of samples. Um, there's no reason why a company like San Miguel couldn't do it in-house. Um, so yes, there is an element of cost. I don't think it's quite as bad as what a lot of people think. Um, but whether it's a case of liability, that might just be a little bit more of the situation, and breweries don't want to put themselves as liable, because there is still a question about whether gluten-free beers are safe for celiacs. But we have a few dedicated customers that are celiacs, and they get on absolutely fine with our beers. But whether it depends on the sensitivity of the person with celiac, and whether they can actually tolerate a gluten removed beer or just a naturally gluten-free beer.
I suppose there's an underlining question there, Sophie, maybe that how many beers out there don't advertise themselves as gluten free, but actually are gluten free. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of breweries that will add the gluten removing enzyme anyway, but not think about testing or not worry about testing because they use it for shelf stability as opposed to gluten removal.
Okay, we're coming to the end now, so we've got a couple more questions. Well, one question. Do you have any, another one asking for recipes? Do you have any good suggestions for naturally gluten-free recipes? It sounds, Sophie, you need to write a book with some recipes. Could be a way forward, but have you got any suggestions?
I mean, you can always refer back to the recipe that I put up on the screen earlier on, with the oats, flaked oats, maize, and sorghum and buckwheat. Actually, that one didn't have sorghum in, but buckwheat. But yeah, it's probably if you're wanting to do a gluten-free recipe, I would recommend minimum 60% malted oats and then just make up the rest with other cereals if you want to have a bit of play around. As I said, something like buckwheat is really nice kind of flavour and characteristic to it. I've not used things like millet, so I don't know what that kind of tastes like in a beer that we've produced. But I know I think Greens use quite a bit of millet, and I think a lot of the other breweries that do alternative grain beers use quite a lot of millet.
Okay, the last question now. Can you describe the major differences in flavour when using cereals other than barley?
Um, so our steel cut was a lot lighter in the mouthfeel. It just felt light and crisp and kind of fairly bright, if that if that's a good flavour descriptor. Not really. But it's less cereally, less bready. I know you can get some bready attributes from yeast. So you can also layer up on your gluten-free beers with a bit of yeast flavour. But yeah, I'd say that they were the steel cut was a lot lighter and a lot felt like it was a bit cleaner than a barley and wheat base would be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. Right, all I need to do now is to sort of thank you, Sophie, on behalf of everybody. It's been an absolutely brilliant webinar, very engaging, and as some people said, I think people appreciate the answers that you're giving, and the questions and answers was really really helpful. So all I'm going to do now is ask everybody if you want to unmute and say thank you all at once. That's fine. But we'll see you next month. Thanks, everyone. So
Thank you very much.
thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really great.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophie.
Okay, thank
Bye.
you. Bye.